Hey, Biology 11. It's time to plunge further into the chordates. Chordates, you remember those? If you don't, we'll back up a little bit here. What you needed to be a chordate was to have these fundamental characteristics: a notochord or stiff rod up the back, a dorsal hollow nerve cord for your basically where your spine would go leading up to the brain, pharyngeal gill slits at some point, and a tail that goes past the anus. Now, as this body type, which is fundamental, took shape, we got things like fish, and now what we're going to move on to is we're going to move on to another member of the vertebrates, that is subphylum Vertebrata, the amphibians. And there's three extant or existing orders. One here you probably haven't seen. You've seen things like salamanders and newts, frogs and toads, but then there's a snake-like one down here known as a caecilian. We'll talk about that. We'll get right into the proper names, and I think now's the best time to start. Okay, so make sure we've got everything ready to go here. So this is chapter 30, section 3, for those of you keeping score, the amphibians. And what's really neat when we look at amphibians is you'll say, well, if they detect sound, fish have a lateral line going down their side. How do these guys detect sound? And it's very prominent. It's sitting right out in the open. And I wanted to show it to you right off the bat because it's pretty cool. This right here, this is a membrane. This is the tympanic membrane. And you can think of that as your eardrum. And it beats up and down, and they can detect sound with it. So in the first slide, right off the bat, we have some goodies. So an amphibian, it comes from an interesting term. This is really split into two parts. Now, amphibios, let's see if I can get that right for me. Amphibios, there we go, is the older term, and it means of two worlds. Now, it just so happens when you think about a frog, they can't stay away from water too long. They have an advantage over the fish. Some fish, we saw this with the snakehead and we saw this with the mudskipper, they sort of have a reverse scuba tank. They can sort of hang out on land for a while, right? In the case of the snakehead, it has a parabranchial organ, so it can even breathe. And there are lungfish, some fish do breathe, but they can't last out of the water for very long. Now, that's not the case with amphibians. As long as they're kind of both worlds, they can survive. Interestingly enough, they have some pretty complex life cycles. If we think about something like a frog as sort of a stock example, you can see that it'll go through a life cycle where it'll be larval, and that has to live in the water, and then it can move onto land, but only once it becomes sort of an adult. Much more of a functional amphibian lifestyle. They breathe with lungs and with gills. That helps them be of two worlds. One thing you'll never see on an amphibian, though, you're not going to see scales and you're not going to see claws. They don't do that. They have very moist skin and they have mucus glands. And some of the members, there's in particular some toads, the brighter the color, the more poisonous they are. I remember seeing it was a remake on, I think it was 1,000 Ways to Die. Terrible show, but they talked about two characters who decided they were going to lick some Australian toads and try to get high from doing that. There's some pretty interesting stuff produced in the skin of some of the toads, but by and large, it's poisonous. So just like the rule of eating berries, don't eat, don't lick, don't consume what you don't know is safe to eat. Let's just put it that way. Okay? So, there you go. Public service announcement. They lack scales and claws. You see, that's what the reptiles really evolve after them. And reptiles take the amphibious body plan and they take it up a notch. The reptiles are able to waterproof their body and even waterproof their eggs, but not the amphibians. The amphibian egg has to be laid in water. All right, so here we go. Let's put a date on it. The first amphibians were popping up around the Devonian period. That's 360 million years ago. Okay? That's I think it's time to change my highlighter. I'm getting a little tired of the old orange here. Let's go with a light green. And then it's a neat app, but unless you take that down, you can't see through it. Okay, 360 million years ago. Fish were about 550 million years, right? So you could see that there was a plentiful amount of time for mutation to occur. Some fish were wiggling up on land. We saw that with the mud skippers. We still do today. In fact, there's a lot of fish that hang out on land and sort of seemed like they wish they could take advantage of all these food sources. It created an evolutionary pressure, without doubt, and it different variations of critters would come up during mutation. We saw that the parabranchial organ, for example, on the snakehead, is kind of like an interesting modified swim bladder. And lungfish have a modified swim bladder where they can consume or gulp air. Catfish do the same thing. So having the ability to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide on land undoubtedly gave something that was fish-like the opportunity it needed to feed. The more it fed, the greater its reproductive chances were. You get the idea. It was really quite a challenge, though, because first of all, you had to breathe air, right? And that was, you couldn't just rely upon gills. You had to have the development. There we go. Ooh, I don't think I want to do that. I think I want that tool. Really, we're talking about the development of lungs. Okay. And the eggs were another issue. In water, they were always going to be well hydrated, but on land, well, the legs were going to dry out. These critters kept their bodies quite moist by producing mucus and things like that to help them get by, but the eggs largely had to be laid in water. And then coming up on land, you don't have as much buoyant force, so your body has to become more, let's just say, stout. It has to resist the pull of gravity. So you need things like hips, and you'll need things like more powerful shoulder girdles to be able to move on land and exercise your muscles against the pull of gravity. So the skeleton had to become that much more. If you watch the snakehead on land, it just kind of wiggles, but its body type isn't well suited to land. It is not good enough. So when we talk about limbs and limb girdles, really what we're talking about is here. Well-functioned hips, and here's the shoulder girdle here. Okay, that becomes quite important. In fact, if you looked sort of incautiously, if you looked at this skeleton right here quickly and then looked away, looked back, or if you showed it to someone quickly and said it was a rat skeleton, it'd be interesting. You could fool probably several people. They really wouldn't know they were looking at an amphibian skeleton there. Of course, a mammalian skeleton has much more development. Much more time has been spent on land. The bone development is just, I'd have to say, more exotic. But the amphibians definitely made a case for staying up on land, and they started to do it quite well. Interesting. Check out this amphibious skeleton. It looks almost crocodilian, doesn't it? But as it turns out, it was the predecessor to anything reptilian. So as they're going through the stages of developing lungs and essentially breathing tubes, trachea, etc., there's a bit more development in the chest cavity. And what they're sort of getting at here is you needed a sternum. And that became a bony shield, and then the ribs started to enclose your important internal organs, particularly your lungs. So coming up on land largely changed the body form in a very predictable way. If you look at amphibian body skeletons, if you look at reptilian, if you look at mammalian, you'll see a lot of similarities here. So there's amphibian adaptations. One thing you shouldn't get, I guess, too excited about are the lungs. The lungs are very primitive. In fact, they remind me a lot of newborn lungs. They're two sacs in the body, right here. So there's the lungs, and you can see the trachea, obviously leading in. Here's your trachea right here, right? And you've got your left and your right lung. But this is not really that impressive of a lung, and it goes up to the nasal nares there, And we'll go through the back of the throat, the pharynx region, and there we go, towards the mouth. These are sac-like organs. They're not as developed as the reptilian ones, and certainly not developed as the mammalian ones. But there's your adaptations. You've got your pelvic girdle right here, which provides the base of support for the legs. And there's also a pectoral girdle, which they're not showing up here, obviously between the two arms. The skin is particularly important because when you look at amphibians, the skin itself, of course, it had to be kept warm, or kept warm. The skin had to be kept moist, and I guess it's fair to say it had to be kept warm. Amphibians can't regulate their body temperature. They're what we call they're ectotherms. Their body temperature is determined by the environment they're in. So amphibians themselves aren't really what you would expect to see in cold climates. You won't find them in the desert. But the skin itself is richly supplied with blood vessels. And that's a tremendous adaptation because what they're doing is they're breathing through their skin. And you and I can't do that. It's not enough even for amphibians to breathe entirely through their skin. It just gives them that little bit of an advantage in exchanging carbon dioxide and oxygen. And the remainder of the work is done by the lungs. And it's highly vascularized. When you pull the skin off a frog, I was watching Duck Dynasty the other day, and they pulled the skin right off the frog, and it's always striking when you see how many blood vessels are really in the skin. Okay, but we'll yak about that at length. So let's see what we've got here. There's quite a few amphibians, and I think you're most familiar with the toads and the frogs. Okay, here's the first thing we have to sort of clarify. Toads and frogs, we're looking at very similar things. Frogs have long bodies and slender legs. It's the toads, over here for example, that tend to have the warty appearance and they're short, dumpy legs. And not that they can't get quite big, but frogs just have a more slender kind of body type. And they're basically, I've heard it said they're all frogs, but there's definitely a distinction you want to make between frogs and toads. Okay, big old toad down there on the left. Down here, we look at the salamanders and the newts. Well, these are pretty neat. And we'll stop in a minute and I'll talk about the specific orders here. But here's a rule. The more bright colored, the much more, how shall we say, poisonous they become. Some tree frogs are amazingly poisonous. So I'm going to pop out a reflection for just a moment. There we go. And just go to my computer because a few things that I want to show you. Here we go. Let's see here. Just one moment. Not quite that. Here we go. So when you look at the types of critters, the ones that I need you to know about, you've got a couple of interesting ones here. You've got frogs here, and they're known as order Anura or Anurans. Okay, and that generally means without a tail. Frogs don't have a tail. Up here, when you look at the Sicilians, they're known, let's zoom in on them, they're known as order Caudata. Now, a way to remember that is that they do have a tail. Now, caudal, in fish, we saw the caudal fin, so that'll help you remember that they are in order Caudata. The ones with a tail, the ones without a tail, and then these guys down here, they're snake-like, and they're called apodans. And we're going to look at these in a lot of detail, but they're they're snake-like with a very poorly developed eye here, and apoda means without feet. I mean, at least these two have feet, and it comes down to a difference of whether or not they have a tail or not, sort of in their adult life. These little worm-like guys, no tail. Okay? So, one more time, apodans, anurans, and caudatans. I know, it's a lot to take in, isn't it? The geographic range is interesting. I wanted to go to this desktop. I like that feature. If you notice what I've been doing there, on my computer I can actually set up multiple desktops and just organizationally quite cool. When you look at anurans, our frogs and toads, they're distribution is pretty well wherever the temperature is warm enough for them to live. Um, you'll see them you'll see them living in Australia, but don't expect to be seeing them here in um, really in the outback unless we're talking about the rainy season. They do have a neat ability to estivate though, where they can during the wet season they will obviously reproduce, feed, and then when you go to a dry in the dry season, they'll form basically like a slime chamber, and they'll hide out in that and wait for the wet season to return. And some of the Aboriginal um, nations have learned that as you're walking through the desert, um, you can tap with a stick, and if your stick breaks through, it's because there was a hollow chamber in the mud pack. And if you find one particular frog, you can you can actually drink the water that it is preserved, and it's enough to help you survive when you're walking through the blazing heat of the outback. A pretty interesting trick, but very wide geographic areas. Point I wanted to make. Okay, now these guys, Gymnophiona, really, let's go back. These are the Sicilians, sort of the are interesting ones. They're sort of snake-like ones. They have a much shorter distribution, much smaller distribution, right? And you can see that this is basically temperate. Has to be quite warm, quite wet where they live. And then our Caudatans, even in Prince George, BC, I live up about here, and we used to find salamanders and things like that quite easily, and they're a little hardier. You'll see that their range, they can go through a little colder temperatures, right? So that's the distribution of those guys. I'll minimize that. A few more goodies for you. What we should do is look at the life cycle of a typical anurin. I'm going to just go in a step through mode here. So if we look at our adult frog in this case, what is the life cycle? Like how does this how do they reproduce if they're hopelessly dependent on water to do so? Well, they don't practice internal fertilization. It's external fertilization. The male will hold on to the female, sometimes up here, but it can be sort of a lower belly grip, as you're seeing here, and fertilizes the eggs as she releases them. Now, when you look at a frog, it's got what's called a cloaca. So that's just, I always describe it as one whole. The sex cells, the urine, the feces are all released out through a common opening. They're not separate as they would be, for example, in a mammal. The egg itself is quite gelatinous, and the fertilized egg is a zygote. This will begin to develop. Now, generally, the eggs, once they're laid, are left in a sort of a. Before we get too far, where is it? I wanted to show you. Ah, here it is. The frog's eggs are just wonderful. I remember finding these in ponds and in bogs, and it's a very interesting sort of gelatinous substance. And you'll find it hanging off reeds and things like that. And you can see them all developing in there. And then as they begin to take shape, that's certainly not it. As they begin to take shape, you see a little life form show up in there. This is, for example, how you would find them in bogs or ponds. Very, very neat. You see the little tadpole beginning to develop in there. Now, these eggs have to be laid in water. They're gelatinous. What amphibians hadn't developed yet, and it comes up in the reptiles, it's an amazing leap, is the amniotic egg. There's no sac around that egg to hold in the moisture, and there's certainly no protective layer over top of the sac. So it's a pretty big distinction to make when you look at their life cycle. This is why they have to be born in the water, because they'll dehydrate hopelessly. Now, once they begin to develop, okay, they're anurins. They do have a tail for a brief period of time. The tadpole itself, once it gets going, is pretty well omnivorous, planktivorous. It'll eat just about anything it can find. And then it'll start to go through a metamorphosis, and the tail, of course, begins to shorten, and it'll go through that stage as it feeds and becomes more complex and become your garden variety frog, which you see here. So there you go. Nice little animation. I have that on the course site. So we'll close that. Some other things. So I'm not trying to make you dizzy here. When they reproduce, it's kind of interesting. It's hard to tell the males from the females. So if you cut into the frog, for example, what you'll be able to determine is the females will have ovarian tissue and there'll be lots of these little black sort of eggs developing. You look for males externally, you can find what are called the nuptial pads. And they've got these neat little pads on the tips of their fingers. And some pictures are a little bit better than others, but you can see it here, and that's for holding on to the female. So nuptials is the reproductive ritual when people get married. Okay, the wedding nuptials. Sorry, not trying to embarrass you, but that's what it's called. And these are the little pads for hanging on. So that's what frogs do. Okay, we should talk a little bit more about frog anatomy. It's pretty interesting. I have to mute it here because I don't want this to be too loud. Frogs have very interesting respiratory organs. Reproductively, they send out their sex cells through the cloaca, the male sperm through his, and the female eggs. Okay. Respiration is pulmonary and from the body. So it's just, so it can breathe in through its nasal nares, it can breathe in through its mouth. And when they're spending time in the water, they'll have the nose just above the level there. The lungs obviously do the lion's share. Let's hit pause there. The lungs will do the lion's share of oxygenating the blood. The skin, it just does a little bit. As a tadpole, it's using gills. There's no functional lungs there. You should look at the amphibian heart. Now this it can be a little bit to take in, but I'll help explain this to you. If you look at the pulmonary vein, the veins lead back to the heart. Arteries lead away from the heart. Now, what's interesting about this vein, this is coming back from the lungs. So I go over this in Biology 12 quite a bit. When you come back from the lungs, it's the only time that a vein we'll talk about the adult case, is supercharged with oxygen. So that vein has highly oxygenated blood. It's bright red. Now you might notice it's the left atrium here is doing what it should do. It's discharging highly oxygenated blood into this ventricle. But you stop for a second, you say, wait, what's going on? There isn't a division in the ventricle, which you would expect to see because, of course, we're mammals and we think everything's like us, right? Not so. The three-chambered heart, if you think back to fish, they had a two-chambered heart. Now, as the heart begins to develop or evolve, as we move to the amphibians, we're sort of seeing an alternation here. Now, it's sort of a regular heartbeat, right? Where this would discharge to the ventricle and then that would go out to the body. Okay, so we kind of have an I go, you go sort of scenario here. The left atrium sends its oxygenated blood to the ventricle and that gets pumped out to the body. Now, check this out. The right atrium is coming back from the vena cava, if anybody's keeping score. It's coming back to the right side of the heart, to the right atrium, and the blood here isn't entirely tired. In fact, it's picked up a little bit of oxygen on its trip to the skin. So this isn't quite blue blood. We could think of it as being somewhat a little bit purplish. But they're using, the left and right atrium, are using just one ventricle. So it's a kind of I go, you go sort of scenario. One's pumping at a little bit different time than the other. These are out of sync. And this beats each time it receives a payload from its relative atrium. That's pretty interesting. So what have you got? You've got a three-chambered heart. And even these structures up here are not as advanced as what you would see, for example, in mammals. We're sort of looking at this going, well, where's the aorta? Anyways, that's above our pay grade right now. Suffice it to say that the aorta is developing, and it's not quite what you would expect to see as in a mammalian heart. Very cool animation. I put this here just so that you would understand that there's it's, there's a systemic circuit where you pump blood to the body and the body consumes it and the blood becomes tired. But there's also a circuit, and it's interesting how they're showing us one thing. The lungs are kicking in, and cutaneous means skin. The skin is also kicking in a little bit. So they breathe through their skin, sort of makes sense. Okay, so back to this. Now, it's interesting when they call a critter cold blooded. You should use the term ectotherm. Now, they can become overheated in their environment or they can become overcooled in their environment. They're at the mercy of the environmental temperature, so they have to find places to live which suit them, or as in the toads in the outback, they need to hide when it gets too hot and you're in the dry season. They need to hide underground and wait for better conditions. So, pretty interesting. An advantage of being cold blooded or ectothermic is that you don't use a ridiculous amount of your energy. You don't use it up so much, and then you don't need to eat as much. Now, you might not think about this with the amphibians, but you certainly do with the snakes, for example. Reptiles, they don't have to eat very often at all. And there's a reason for that. They're not heating their bodies with that chemical energy. And if you don't have to heat your body with the chemical energy, you don't have to eat as much. So, pretty smart. Pretty smart stuff. Okay. So, all right, I'm going to go back from my messy desktop here to my details of my slideshow. So we'll turn reflection back on. There we go. And look at frogs because we do a frog dissection. I'm sorry we can't pick up the Sicilians, the snake-like ones. It's just not that simple. But the frog anatomy is when you start to really see vertebrate anatomy come into focus. I mean, dissecting a fish is one thing, but in a frog, you actually see kidneys and things that you would expect to see. So we'll take a little tour here. The mouth is obviously that's the mouth. The pharynx region begins here and pull the food in down the esophagus into the stomach. And you'll notice if we kind of zoom in on the stomach, right? It's one organ. It's not really split into two. So the crop and the gizzard have kind of become integrated. Makes sense. And we see a small intestine, zoom in on that, begin to take shape. Now that's pretty neat. The intestine itself, when you saw a fish, and you think back even to when we were looking at annelids with worms, you really only saw just kind of like one intestine. But we're starting to see sort of a small and a large intestine beginning to form here. Right? And this, a lot of people don't realize that the small intestine is also a digestive organ. Now, for those of you keeping track, the duodenum does a lot of digestion in ourselves, but you've got to remember that the small intestine isn't just about absorption. Okay, the jejunum and the ileum portions of the small intestine do a lot of that, but the first portion of the small intestine does an incredible amount of digesting, helps out the stomach, if you will. Let's zoom in on a few things here. What have we got? Well, we've got a liver, and it's producing bile. And there we go. You've got a gallbladder right there, which stores the bile, okay, and then sends it down to the small intestine. Now that's pretty amazing. The gallbladder is seen in reptiles. It's seen in mammals, right? The liver itself is an amazing organ, helps with digestion. Specifically, what's going on with the gallbladder is it stores bile, which helps with the digestion of fat. Okay, the pancreas, this little tongue-shaped organ, I'm just going to do a little erasing here. This tongue-shaped organ is pretty neat because it produces all sorts of digestive juices. Pancreatic amylase helps to digest starch, helps to neutralize stomach acid. It also helps to digest protein. So we're getting a complex digestive organ, and it's hooking up to the first portion of the small intestine as well. So that's a good thing. So the digestive system has become pretty advanced. And in the stomach of a couple of critters that we've dissected, specifically frogs that we get for class, we've found small mammals, partly digested, entirely digested, scorpions, all sorts of great stuff. It's tremendous. Pretty gross, but pretty neat to find that. There's a large intestine, which they're mentioning here, right? There's your large intestine there. There's your small intestine there. And you notice that the large intestine comes out into a common area, okay, called the cloaca. The sex cells are released from that area. It's just a common sort of point of union. The feces will come out. Any urine all comes out through there. Okay, so let's make a little, I guess, a little highlight note. So waste, here we go. Urine, eggs, everything goes out through the cloaca. That's that right there. We talked about respiration. In fact, I've kind of gotten that out of the way. Larval amphibians can use their skin, and as it turns out, they've got gills. So, the skin is highly vascularized. Come here, you. It's fighting me. The skin is highly vascularized, which means a lot of blood vessels are brought near the surface, and that allows diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Okay? Now, when you look at the larger adults, they're just not as effective at breathing through their skin. Sometimes the lining of the mouth has a lot of blood vessels too, but the lungs really have to take over. Okay? Even though there's some cutaneous respiration as well, helping out. There we go. I'm going to try and get a new pen. This one drives me crazy. When we look at the circulatory system and excretory system, we'll zoom in here. I see a couple of things that are worth note. Unlike the fish, when we were looking at in our previous unit, the kidney I mentioned of, let's say, of a perch, for example, runs just along the backbone. And when you clean a fish and you run your thumbnail up there, you're pushing its kidney right out. Now the kidney has become a set of duplicate organs, which is, you can see this. This is the vena cava right here. And once they cleanse the blood, the renal vein will lead into the vena cava and it'll send the blood back up to the heart. So pretty neat. The heart has the two little flaps. A lot of people don't realize that atria are not that exciting. They're quite small. And when you're looking at a heart, the bulk of the muscle you're looking at is usually the ventricle, but it doesn't have a division down the middle. The ventricle's not divided. We see our lungs, ureters. Those are the little tubes that lead down to the bladder. So these guys have a bladder, which is an advanced structure, which can lead out through the cloaca. And of course, they would have very watery urine. They're not like the reptiles where they have extremely concentrated urine, or even the birds for that matter. A lot of people don't realize that when a bird releases that white paste, that the white paste is uric acid. That literally is their pee, and the little dark bits in it are their poop. In this case, they don't concentrate their urine as much because they're spending a lot of time in the water. There's our frog metamorphosis, reproductive life cycle. And just to point out, there's the fertilized eggs, submerged, hanging around some plants. And there's our circle of life. There you go. Tadpoles with gills and breathing through their skin until they become young frogs. And this is why we call them the neurons, because the tail is gone by this point. So life cycle, they live a couple of years. Not a tremendously long life cycle, but a little bit longer than some would expect. We know they do external fertilization, no surprises there. But I find their sense organs to be really neat. Right off the bat, I talked about the tympanic membrane here, which is basically their eardrum. It doesn't see that as text. Oh well, that's okay. I'll just go manual. So you've got their eardrum there. Sense organs. Interestingly, how it's interesting how they put their eyes right up on top of the head. Extremely smart positioning for looking around in all directions. They see anything coming from the sides, makes them good hunters as well. There's their nasal nair right there. And their mouth's pretty interesting. They have a palate with little vomerine teeth, and those are just like gripping teeth, right? Not for shredding or biting down. Interestingly enough, groups of amphibians, we should put the names in here now. Salamanders and newts. Let's put in order because that's what we're looking at. This is, when we're looking at amphibians, it's class Amphibia, and these guys are, let's make sure, Chordata, order Chordata. There we go. Anura. It's fighting me. Okay. Anura. There we go. And Sicilians, Apodens. There we go. And this just is a little overview of the salamanders and the newts. They're pretty cute. Very good at regenerating, by the way. We're still studying why their tissues will regenerate. In particular, they'll lose a tail, just grow it right back. No big deal. They're a little bit more capable of hiding under rocks and staying in wet nooks and crannies. That's pretty neat. We used to find these as kids in a little area called College Heights. Frogs and toads, obviously with the ability to jump. The toads are the shorter legged little guys with more of the warts. So if you're wondering or keeping score, here's our toads and here's our frog. Right? Dead giveaway is that nice warty feature in the short, stunty body. Like that. Sicilians, I'm glad you finally get a good shot of them here. They're apodens for the reason that they're legless. And you see that they had a very restricted sort of area, not sort of tropical, subtropical. And they just go around looking for small things that they can feed on. And if they spend a lot of time underground, so the eye isn't super important. When they're looked at, they look like, at first you look at it and say, boy, that's a big nightcrawler. But in fact, what you're looking at is a full-fledged amphibian with all the amphibious characteristics. Okay, that kind of takes us to the end. Make a couple of recommendations here for you. So I'm going to turn off mirroring. There we go. On the course site for this topic, let's make sure I'm on the right page. Go back to my first desktop. The lesson amphibians right here, you want to click on that, and I've got some great stuff for you. Obviously, I'm not going to show YouTube videos while I'm recording the video. There's the Fish to Amphibians video down here, and bugs, dinosaurs, mammals, that's worth checking out. But the one that's my stock favorite is this one down here, the Sicilians snake-like amphibians, where it's a little link to a YouTube video put on by the BBC, and they talk in detail about Sicilians, so you really get to know more about them. And I highly suggest you take a tour of that and through these. I've used several of these animations just sort of in an overview. If you're really squeamish about dissecting frogs, the last thing I have for you here is the virtual frog dissection right there. Okay, so what is that? Let me go to my desktop with that. So I have to mute it because otherwise it makes a lot of noise. Once you click this, you're able to go into the virtual frog dissection, and you literally do what it says. You pin your poor frog down. You have to drag these. You kind of get the idea. And you go through the steps of dissecting the frog. So all you're dissecting are photons here, so you don't have to feel nearly as guilty. Select the scalpel from the toolbar. Got it. Place the scalpel on the incision point. Right there. Make an incision, and you just pull down. Find it easier than with a mouse and with a glide pad. Anyways, you get the idea. You make the lateral incisions. This is called making windows, and open up the frog for everything there is to see. But you're going to have to go check it out because I'm not going to do the whole virtual dissection online for you. This little guy is waiting for you. He wants to see you as soon as you can get to it. Of course, we do dissect the frogs in class when we do it's kind of like dissectorama. Fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and we even have some pigeons to take a look at for the bird representative, and for the mammals once we get to them, well, heck, that's the rat. Good fun. Okay, I'm done. I hope you guys enjoyed. Please go check out the animations and the videos because that's where you do the learning, and it's not all about listening to me. You have to roll up your sleeves and go check out some stuff. Okay, folks, have a good one.